Okay, let's talk about our tenancies. First of all, we have our term of years and our periodic tenancies. These are the most common types of tenancies. Let's quick talk about term of years. This is, of course, an express agreement in the lease for to be a beginning and end date. Do they always have to be in writing? Oral leases for less than a year are valid. Okay, you can have a term of years lease for 364 days, and if so, you don't need to comply with the statute of frauds. But if the lease is for a year or more, we need it signed or writing signed by the party against whom enforcement is sought. One thing that's important to know about a term of lease is that there's no notice required to terminate the lease. Think about a term of years lease as self-terminating. No notice is required. The lease is terminated unless the landlord renews. Okay, if it's more than a year, we need the statute of frauds signed by the party against whom enforcement is sought. If not, an oral lease for less than a year, hey, that's valid. Now, let's talk about a periodic tenancy. So, of course, our most common example would be month to month, but there's no requirement of that. Do we need a writing signed against the party to be charged? No, unless the period is more than a year. So if we have a periodic tenancy and for whatever reason, the facts tell us that it is a year-to-year term or something crazy, then pretty much we are not going to need a writing. Okay. Now, unlike a term of years, remember a term of years tenancy is what? Self-terminating. There is no notice requirement. A periodic tenancy continues indefinitely until the landlord notifies the tenant of termination. Okay, so term of years, self-terminating, no notice required. Periodic continues until the landlord notifies the tenant that it is terminated. Okay, well, how long does that notice need to be? Generally, it's the length of the tenancy up to 6 months. 6 months is our hard deadline. For a commercial tenancy, generally 6 months notice is required. For a residential tenancy, remember, it's the length of the tenancy up to 6 months. So if it's a month-to-month lease, we need 30 days notice. Okay, you can create a periodic tenancy by implication. How do we do this? A holdover tenant and the landlord accepts rent. When the landlord accepts rent from a holdover tenant, they have, guess what, created a new periodic tenancy. And by the way, if we have a tenancy for a term of years and the landlord accepts rent after that termination date, they just created, guess what? That's right, a periodic tenancy. It's not a periodic tenancy for a year. It will be likely imputed as a month-to-month tenancy. Okay, for both of these tenancies, what happens if somebody dies? The death of a party, the lease obligation, you don't get off the lease if you're dead. That obligation passes to the estate and it is enforceable. When are we going to see this? Let's say we're enforcing an option to buy on a leased property. So the lease doesn't terminate at death. Instead, the obligation passes to the dead person's estate. Okay, tenancy at will. Okay, a tenancy at will does have to be expressly created, and it continues until one party terminates it. Or another party could, of course, assign their interest, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So tenancy at will, it must be expressly created, and it continues until one party terminates it or someone transfers their interest. Okay, now tenancy at sufferance. Here's where we get to talk about the American rule and the English rule. This is so much fun. Okay. All right. Tenancy at sufferance. The landlord has some choices. They can accept rent. So what happens then? That's right. We created a new periodic tenancy. This is the evidence of the landlord's intent that the tenant remain on the land. Okay, is this going to be for another year? No, no. But for commercial leases in excess of a year, a court will permit a landlord to impose a year-to-year tenancy. So you are a store in a shopping mall, and your lease is over. The landlord accepts rent. Your lease was for 5 years. The court will likely permit the landlord to make you stay for an additional year. Okay, so what are our choices here? Accept rent and create a new periodic tenancy. The other landlord choices are to evict or sue for damages. Okay, if the tenant's not at fault or the holdover period was minor, say a few hours, that doesn't create tenancy at sufferance. And remember, of course, there's no self-help in evictions. Okay, so for tenancy at sufferance, remember the landlord has the duty to deliver possession. So in America, we follow the English rule, meaning the landlord must deliver possession and the right to possess. The English rule, the landlord must deliver possession and the right to possess. So what if the landlord doesn't do these things? You get there, there's a holdover tenant. You can, 1, terminate the lease, and 2, sue the landlord for possession and damages. Okay, under the American rule, by contrast, the landlord only delivers the right to possession, and new tenant, you must sue to evict that holdover tenant. Okay, English rule. You, the landlord, must deliver, that's right, possession plus the right to possess. Tenant, you can terminate the lease, that's right, and sue the landlord for what? That's right, possession and damages. Under the American rule, the landlord only has to deliver what? Possession. And so tenant must sue to evict the holdover tenant. Okay, remember when you accept rent, you create a new periodic tenancy. There's no tenancy at sufferance if the holdover period is minor. The other thing to remember here is that no notice is required to terminate a lease that is for a term of years, whereas a periodic tenancy continues indefinitely until the landlord notice of termination. And for a commercial tenant, that's likely 6 months notice. For a residential tenancy, likely it's 30 days. All right, and those are our tenancies.